Yesterday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a so-called anti-riot bill into law. So the measure increases law enforcement's powers to crack down on protesters. DeSantis said that the bill is about public safety, that he doesn't want any Florida city to end up like Portland.
Despite pushback from Democrats on the merits of the bill, DeSantis says the people of Florida support the crackdown.
And I think what we've seen what the left does is they concoct narratives. They don't really have any facts to support the narratives because I can give you a copy of the bill. Show me. They can't do that. So they try to run with narratives thinking that somehow that's going to help them politically. But I can tell you in this instance, it's backfired on them. The people of Florida are with us on this. They don't want to see disorder in the streets. They don't want to see their lives or livelihoods jeopardized by some crazed mob. And so we did the right thing.
Democratic strategist and owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth Karp, and Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, join us now to discuss. Rachel, what do you think about Governor DeSantis' take on the criticism?
Well, look, I think due process concerns are always valid, especially in the wake of some of the protests that we saw last summer, especially in the wake of January 6th, where you have some protesters sitting in 23 hours of solitary confinement a day, which, by the way, Elizabeth Warren has actually come to their defense, which surprised me. But, I think his justification for the bill is, has merit as well. Look, we're coming off a summer where you saw 140 cities protest. Some of those were peaceful and some of those were very violent. You saw $2 billion worth of insurance claims. The Guardian newspaper reports up to 25 deaths related to these protests. So I do think that there's reason to be concerned that, violence and protests may break out in the wake of the Chauvin verdict. But I do think concerns from the ACLU should be taken into light, given what we saw last summer.
Jen, there's a lot going on here, and to get into a couple of the specific provisions, as Rachel and our intro alluded to, this would make it much easier to arrest protesters. One of the provisions that has people really concerned is it would basically pave the way for people to be able to, it would create less legal trouble for people who run over protesters with their cars. Some have said this would have made, the white supremacists who killed Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, this would have let him get off, for example. And then there's also just the hypocrisy of the Republicans and DeSantis in particular, who loves to talk about free speech and how you don't want to have censorship and you've got to have, First Amendment protection. Well, this is antithetical to the First Amendment here. There are already laws in place. If people are violent and they're breaking the law, they should be arrested. And those protesters, by and large, were when that happened over the summer. You don't need to expand a police state in order to make sure that your citizens are safe.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I can say 2024 is certainly off to the races. I think that Governor DeSantis is trying to draw Democrats into a very unpopular conversation. And I think that Democrats need to be very careful in how they discuss this bill, because Republicans are excellent at framing these type of controversies. And being brutally honest, Democrats are terrible at it. You will see Democrats across Congress be put on the record defending rioting instead of focusing on the provisions of this bill, which are incredibly problematic, like removing adding civil protections to people who drive through crowds who are peacefully protesting. Now, I think we need to be careful to say that this does not remove criminal culpability for hurting somebody when you do that, but it does protect them civilly. And instead of us making that distinction, you're going to see Democrats across the country say rioting is okay and destruction of property is okay in order to get your point across. That is the exact wrong place to be here. And that is exactly where Ron DeSantis wants us to be. And I think that we need to be extremely careful about that. What we also need to point out in this horrible bill is that you can now be arrested at a peaceable assembly that turns violent if you are present there. That is something that is extremely scary and extremely draconian that we should be focused on. So I think that Democrats need to be laser focused on the provisions of this bill, which remove due process, which punish people for peaceably assembling. Of course, it's ironic and hilarious in light of defending the January 6th Capitol rioters and protesters that Ron DeSantis would pass this kind of bill, but he is teeing up a culture war issue in Florida. And unfortunately, I think he's right. I think the Florida voters are with him because of the way that he explains it. And I think we've seen over the last several decades that Florida voters are not particularly sophisticated when it comes to this type of issue. They believe the rhetoric that is put out by the Republican Party, and the Democrats fall for it every single time. So I think that we need to be very specific when we talk about this law and move on to the things that people really care about in their day-to-day life.
Well, Rachel, there are a couple things I want to pick up on there. First of all, you mentioned actually earlier the ACLU's opposition to this bill. I actually wish that I could trust the ACLU's criticism of bills like this. I no longer feel that they're a legitimate source of information when I'm trying to understand what's actually happening in a piece of legislation. And on the second point, I also think, there is clearly a need in a lot of communities to handle, from the law enforcement perspective and from the local government perspective, some of these protests that turn into riots better. But at the same time, there is this kind of increasing bipartisan awareness that law enforcement, the excesses of law enforcement on protesters that are peaceful, can be troublesome. Do you think Ron DeSantis here is striking the right balance between free speech and actually this real need to say small business owners have gotten crushed with the expenses of some of these riots? They have put a lot of people in danger. We saw way too much violence and destruction last summer. What's the balance, and is Ron DeSantis striking it?
Well, I do want to make two distinctions. I disagree, I think, with Jen that Florida voters are being taken for a ride. I think they're smarter than that. I think what they are reflecting is the concern that you just pointed out, which is in a lot of small communities, you didn't see adequate police protection. You didn't see a lot of these rioters actually get charged. Many of them that were taken into custody never ended up getting charged. And I think people are saying, why? Where is the justice for my business that got looted? Where is the due process for my concerns? And so I think Ron DeSantis is trying to reflect that by passing a new, set of laws designed to penalize what is obviously rioting behavior and perhaps make it easier for the government to bring charges. Now, where I sit is I think we overcriminalize a lot of things in this country. And, I worry that an overreaction to what is a justifiable outrage. Like in the city where I grew up in upstate New York, businesses were looted. People felt they had to defend themselves and the police never showed up. You never want someone to be in that position. So we have to be careful not to overreact to that with the heavy hand of the state necessarily. That, again, you are seeing current law being used to put rioters from January 6th in solitary confinement for 23 hours. I don't think that that's appropriate.
This goes actually to a conversation Emily and I were having earlier. The fact that law enforcement failed in some of these circumstances does not justify giving law enforcement more power and more tools and criminalizing additional behavior. I look at those stats of the number of protesters who were released without being charged completely differently. I look at it as like they were swept up and they were put in jail and basically didn't, the police or whoever couldn't figure out anything that they actually did wrong in which they broke the law. So I look at that in the polar opposite way. And Jen, on your point about some of the behavior that's criminalized here, just to be really clear about what this stands, and this is from the ACLU in Florida. As you were pointing out, if you're at a protest that then turns violent through no fault of your own, you can be arrested even if you didn't engage in violent conduct and charged with a third-degree felony and face up to 5 years in prison and a loss of your voting rights for going out to a protest that through no fault of your own turns violent. That is a dramatic infringement on First Amendment rights. I fear your political analysis is correct here, though, Jen, that the way he talks about this is actually very effective, and people are really afraid for, they don't want to see lawlessness in the streets. They want things to be orderly, even as they broadly support the goals of racial equality and the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement. Speak a little bit about how formidable DeSantis is at this point, because he seems to be the one that does the best job of picking up on these sort of right-wing cultural issues that also have some support in the public and creating some kind of a bill, some kind of a show around. He went after the tech companies. He's doing this. I know there was another thing we covered here that's escaping me at the moment, but he seems to be, of the Republicans who are positioning themselves for 2024, he seems to be the one that is the most adept at pulling this thing off.
Governor DeSantis is a political Rorschach test right now in Florida. And I think that depending on how you view his leadership in Florida during COVID, and during some of the rioting and going after big tech, I think says a lot about where you as an individual sits politically. Obviously, every time he opens his mouth, I'm horrified. Except somebody else said something very poignant about him, and I wish I remembered who it was, but I saw it on one of the news shows where they said he is Trump but nice. And that should be very scary to Democrats, because if you remember, towards the end of Donald Trump's presidency, he still had an over 60% approval rating in terms of policies that he was trying to enact. Now, his personal, approval rating was obviously in the dumps because he was an awful character in history. But in terms of what he was trying to do with the country, Democrats did not do a good enough job defending their policy positions in the light of his presidency. And things that he was passing was speaking to kitchen table issues across the country. That is dangerous because it allowed these cultural issues to fester. And instead, Democrats focused almost entirely on those. I do have to give President Biden credit because his campaign towards the end did focus on building back better and economic issues, and it's the economy, stupid. And I think that in conjunction with Trump's meltdown during the campaign really did bring us the White House. But that's not going to hold the House in 2022, and that's not going to retain the Senate in 2022. I think we have to be exceedingly forceful in these issues. And with 2024 spinning up already in the middle of 2022 midterms that are staring us in the face, these issues are going to continue popping up. And I think Democrats need to be very focused in how they message on them, pointing out, Crystal, like you just said, the real issues with the bill, and then moving forward about how we can fix them is the way to message this. One of the things that Democrats are completely missing about some of the rioting that happened across the country is that gun sales skyrocketed in 2020. Absolutely through the roof, some of the highest numbers we have ever seen. So if you are concerned about gun ownership and gun control in this country, then you should be looking very carefully at how to message about riots that happen across the country. Of course, we need to protect the right to peaceably assemble. The horror that we witnessed last summer and the Black Lives Movement putting together one of the biggest civil rights marches that we've seen across the country in decades was very important to focus on. Instead, you heard Democrats across the country defend rioting and looting as something that we should tolerate in our civilized society. That messaging married to that policy is a loser in the next 2 to 4 years.
I think important points all around, ladies. Thank you so much. And we're going to have more Team Rising for you after this.